Hey everyone, welcome to another class in international politics. Today we're going to be talking about our second family of theories. And this family of theories is referred to as a liberalism. And so we'll be looking at a few different variants of liberalism, but they all share some of the same assumptions. All right, so liberalism is a domestic level theory, so domestic level explanations for war, or just in general, kind of referring back to our definition of international politics for the causes of conflict and cooperation. So similar to realism, we sometimes point back to some earlier thinkers in philosophy who kind of are consistent with the liberal tradition, or in some ways consistent, who kind of inspired the liberal tradition. Again, they're very similar from modern liberalism and political science, but still we tend to put back to some of the roots. So people like Immanuel Kant, Adam Smith, and John Stuart Mill. So to begin, we're going to start with a few assumptions that kind of unify the different schools of liberalism. So we're going to look at 3 different variants of liberalism in a second, but all of them share in the same basic assumptions. And we'll look a little at how they're different from the realist ones that we saw. So the first is the primacy of societal actors, right? So the fundamental actors in international politics are individuals or groups. So remember in realism, in neorealism, we looked at the primary actors were states, and in particular, the great powers. But in liberalism, the fundamental actors are individuals and private groups who are on the average rational and risk averse, so similar to realism, and who organize exchange and collective action to promote differentiated interests under constraints imposed by material scarcity, conflicting value, and variations in societal influence, right? So each different person has their own interests, right? Um, and they organize exchange and collective action to promote these different interests, right? Under conditions of material scarcity, right? So there's not, we're always operating in domestic and in international politics in a world where there's limits on material resources, right? So not everybody can have everything they could possibly want. There's also conflicting values. You know, people have different ideas about how society should be arranged, and varieties in societal influence. So within any different society, some people have greater influence over the decision making than others. In democracies, it tends to be more evenly spread, but even then, there's people with different levels of influence, even within democracies. Then within authoritarian regimes, it's even smaller group of people who have influence, right? So it's looking at the process of how these individuals get, the best they can, and how they organize and try to influence, the political process based on their desire to increase, their benefits, operating under the constraints placed by there's not enough resources for everyone. Not everybody agrees on how society should be organized and what society should be pursuing, and not everybody has the same amount of power to achieve what they'd like to achieve. Second assumption relates to representation and state preferences. States or other political institutions represent some subset of domestic society on the basis of whose interests state officials define state preferences and act purposefully in world politics. So remember, in neorealism, states were unitary actors. So we didn't look within the state to see competing interests, right? We just said, this is Canada's interest. And the primary interest, while they could pursue secondary interests, the primary interest was security. In liberalism, we do not assume the interests of states. So states could be pursuing any number of different interests. And we also don't, they also don't assume, or don't treat states as unitary actors, right? So they open up the state to look inside and look at the competition for how the national interest will be reached, right? So in any given state, so the state does need to have a national interest, right? They can't pursue too many goals at the same time, right? States have to choose what goals they're going to be pursuing. And so Liberalism is looking at how it is that states choose these, right? Within any given state, there's going to be conflicting desires about what these goals should be. And the state has to somehow choose which ones it's going to do, it's going to pursue. And so it must choose so on the basis of, so it choose on the basis of whose interests state officials define state preferences and act proposively, right? So imagine, again, so say you've got like, 3 groups in society, group 1 wants to pursue X policy, group B, actually, rather than that, let's just even go with an example. It's one that will recur throughout the course. Let's take trade, right? So you have some people within society who like the idea of free trade. And then there's others who do not like free trade. They like some form of protectionism to protect their own products and to protect their own jobs and wealth, right? Now, a state can either be for free trade or it could be protectionist, right? And there could be some kind of middle ground, but largely a state is either a free trader with a few exceptions or it's protectionist. But they're conflicting goals. And so for the most part, the state has to choose, are we a free trading state or are we a protectionist state? Again, there could be some middle ground. Even free trading states have, probably have some domestic groups that are strong enough to win out and get protectionist policies put in place. But again, they're, for the most part, mutually exclusive. You can't be protectionist and free trading at the same time. So when the state, so you've got both groups within society, but the state has to figure out how it's going to choose which one becomes the national interest, which one becomes the one that we represent on the international stage. And so liberalism is partially looking at the process of how it is that of all of these different desires within states, you end up selecting the ones that will become state preferences, which one of the individual preferences or group preferences will become state preferences, and that the state will pursue internationally. And then finally, interdependence in the international system. So the configuration of interdependent state preferences determines state behavior. So realism doesn't really look at interdependence and how you rely on other states. This is something that liberalism brings in more because remember in neorealism, you're pursuing the self-help. So you don't want to be relying on others. Now there's exceptions in terms of alliances where to a certain extent you are relying on others, but because liberalism allows states to pursue more varied goals, there's more opportunity for working with others. And interdependence doesn't even necessarily require working with others. So what interdependence largely means is that the ability to get what you want depends on what others do. So you cannot say you have a certain goal. Again, like say your goal is international free trade, right? Your ability to acquire this goal. So you could open up all of your markets. You could say, we're going to have no tariffs on anything. So we're going to be a free trading state. We won't tax anything coming into our country, right? But the ability to achieve kind of a free trade international system, right, depends on what others are going to do. Because while you have unique control over what you can do with your taxes and barriers to trade, you have no control over what other states are going to do in terms of their barriers to trade, right? So you could have no taxes on imports, but the goods that you export are subject to whatever taxes other states put in place. So if you want to have an international trading system, a free trading system, your ability to achieve this goal is dependent also on what other states do. So states are interdependent. The ability to achieve goals depends on what other states do. And for many things in international politics, you're going to end up finding that international politics is, or interdependence is more of a fact of life than kind of independence. In most areas, your ability to achieve what you want, your goals, depends on what other states do. And so states don't, so states have the goals that they've chosen, once states have chosen the goals that they'd like to pursue. So within, the the pool of available ones within society, how they pursue them, so how they actually behave on the international system, doesn't just depend on these goals, but it also depends on the preferences of other states, right? Because how you achieve these goals depends on what others want. So for example, if all other states want a free trading system, then achieving a free trading system is relatively simple, and your own independent self-action will probably get there, combined with other states' independent action. But if others don't want an international free trading system, then your behaviors will have to be either you're going to have to respond to the fact that others don't want it, or you're going to have to be working to try to convince them or coerce them into adopting this type of system. You'll have to enter into some form of negotiation, because that's what you're going to need to do to get the policy that you want. So your state behavior, the policies you're going to have to choose to try to maximize your achievement of your national interest, is going to depend on what other states want. So it brings other states a little bit more into the equation as well. So what are the variants of liberalism? So there's three main families, and they'd be commercial liberalism, ideational liberalism, and Republican liberalism, not related to the Republican Party itself. Okay, so we'll go through each of them in turn. So commercial liberalism focuses on individual and collective behavior of states based on the patterns of market incentives facing domestic and transnational economic actors. So remember again, when we were talking about the first principle, so societal actors, trying to achieve their desires based on scarcity of resources, different values, and different societal positions. This one's facing on the scarcity side, right? So there's limited resources within the world, so you don't necessarily have everything that you want. And so there's different market incentives facing domestic and transnational economic actors. So this is the one commercial liberalism in the name would suggest, focuses most on domestic and international economy. So basically the argument goes that changes in the structure of domestic and global economy alter the costs and benefits of transnational economic exchange, creating pressures on domestic governments to facilitate or block such exchanges through appropriate foreign economic and security policy. So again, let's go back to our trade example, right? Changes in the domestic economy, right, can produce different preferences for whether you like free trade or oppose free trade, right? So you'll normally have advocates for both within a country, but say changes in which industries are dominant or changes in the industry within your domestic economy, changes that you move from a domestic economy where most people favor free trade to an economy where most people oppose free trade. Right? And so because of these changes in your domestic economy, you're going to have more pressures on people to, say, in that scenario, block free trade, right? And so it'll create pressure on the domestic government to, in this case, block such exchanges using appropriate foreign and security policies. So to block free trade. The flip side could be to facilitate free trade using appropriate economic and security policies, right? So, and this could be not based on any change of ideas among people, but just based on, if you work in an industry where you benefit from free trade, then you're going to support free trade. And if you work in an industry where you oppose free trade, you're going to oppose free trade. So it's not necessarily a change in ideas, but it's a change on, if there's a growth in free trade supporting industries, then there'll be more pressure on the government to facilitate free trade. If there's a growth in industry with domestic industry that oppose free trade or that are hurt by free trade, then there'll be increased pressure on the government to block free trade and to pursue international policies in accordance with that. So there's also could be changes in the global economy, right? That also will put change pressure, right? So say there's no change in domestic economy, but because of changes in the global economy, so say you're in agricultural industry, right? And you used to have, really good prices for your products, and so you liked free trade because you export a lot to the global market. But there's changes in the global economy. Say a whole number of new states emerge who have cheaper currencies, change in the global economy where their currencies fall, and they're agricultural countries too, so they can now export a lot of agricultural products at a lower price. So now, now not only are you having more difficulty exporting, but you're even facing competition within your own domestic market from cheaper goods coming in from outside. So you nothing's changed in the domestic economy, but there's been changes in the global economy. And so now these agricultural producers are probably saying, no, we don't like free trade anymore. And so we're going to put pressure on the government to pursue international economic and security policies that limit free trade. Market structure doesn't always create incentives for cooperation, right? So there's often been kind of this assumption that, commercial liberalism, there's going to be pressure always for increased cooperation, kind of with the assumption that there's going to be, dominance of, say, free trade, open economy type pressures. But that's not necessarily the case, right? There's going to be some changes in economic structure or market structure that create opportunities for cooperation. There's also going to be some changes that create discord, right? So you have two countries that are competing over the same resources or that are in the same industries and are cooperating and are competing for dominance, or two different countries that require the same resources for industries that are important to them. And so they end up going into conflict over access to these resources, right? So it changes the market structure, could create opportunities for cooperation, but also can create opportunities for conflict. So example of some commercial liberal theories that look at kind of impact of international and domestic economy on, say, causes of conflict, right? So there's certain ones who look at the possibilities of or link between trade, international trade, and war. So many liberal thinkers, including Kant and Smith, so Immanuel Kant and Adam Smith, believe that free trade produces peace. There's a few different reasons identified. So first, war disrupts profits of trade, right? So if you're doing a lot of trade with another country, so Canada and the US are doing a lot of trade with each other, right? If we start fighting each other, that's going to disrupt trade, right? Obviously, if we're fighting, products aren't moving across the border as freely. With there being a lot of trade, there's a lot of people whose economic well-being in both countries depend on this free trade, right? Either they like buying the goods from that other country, so they get products more cheaply from that country, so disruptions mean they don't get those products, or they have to pay more to buy it domestically, or they're selling products abroad, right? And their economic well-being in terms of having any income or a large part of their income depends on selling abroad, right? So all of these people would be opposing war because of, it hurts their bottom line, it hurts them economically. Economic growth from trade increases domestic power of supporters of free trade. When you have high levels of trade between countries, those who are doing well from it, they'll have increased power, and so they're more likely to be the ones who are influencing foreign policy making, right? To be the dominant groups domestically, who are the ones who are able to get their voices heard in shaping foreign policy, and they're going to be opposing war. And trading states have a stake in the economic well-being of other states, right? There's an element of interdependence, right? So again, Canada and the US are heavily trading states. So let's just think about the viewpoint of the exporters from both countries, right? Canadian industries that are exporting to the US want the US to be as strong as possible, because a stronger US economy means more people that can buy the exported goods. And the same thing for American exporters, right? They want the Canadian economy to be doing as well as possible, because decline in wealth of Canadian importers or consumers means decline in exports. So there's a reason that, if the US enters into a recession, Canada often follows not long after. And part of the reason being that many Canadians earn a large part of their income from exporting to the US. If the US is less able to buy those goods, or has a diminished the number of goods that they're buying, that hurts the bottom line of many Canadian companies. That means that those companies are earning less and are less able, therefore, the employees or leaders and the employees or employers in the business, they're less able to consume, which hurts other Canadian businesses. And so therefore you have an economic slowdown. So this is kind of the large argument that's existed for saying that increasing trade between different countries will diminish the likelihood of war between those trading countries. There's been opponents too, again, within the liberal family, right? So this is, again, how neorealists sometimes will disagree. So we talked about polarity. Some say multipolar is more stable. Some say bipolar is more stable. Some might say unipolar is more, but all within the family of neorealism. They just view different implications based on how things will work with a different polarity. Again, similar here within commercial liberals, right? They have different, based on kind of look at the same world, they write different stories about how trade and war are related. So critics contend that trade can also produce conflict, particularly over the division of gains. Right? So it could be two states that are competing over the same resources, but also could be, so even when you've got free trading states, some gain more than others. So say you've got open borders, right? You'll always have kind of some who say, okay, so we've got open borders, and yes, both of us are gaining a lot, right? Canada's gaining a lot, US is gaining a lot. But the US might turn to Canada and say, but you're gaining more than we are. So it's unfair relationship. Or Canada could turn to the US and say, yes, we're gaining, but you're gaining a lot more. And so you're not acting fairly in this. The terms of this trade arrangement is benefiting you more than it's benefiting us. And we want to take steps to rectify that. We should both be gaining in an equitable manner. So you could have conflicts over who's gaining more from the free trade arrangement. Outside of just free trade, right? Like I said, you could have conflicts over, say, resources that are required for economic activity. You could have conflict over access to those different ones. And in fact, so there's a lot of evidence to point to trade promoting peace. There's also some evidence pointing to trade not having as much of a specific or peace-enhancing impact. Now, again, this is relatively anecdotal, and so, but one of the highest periods of international trade in global history was among European states right before World War I. And it's, at levels that rival international trade, in the last few decades. And so, and we ended up in a world war despite such high levels of trade. Now, it could be that trade actually made the war less likely, but all of the other factors that can produce war were so strong that despite the pacifying effect of free trade, we still ended up with war. If we didn't have free trade, war would have happened earlier or would have been even more likely, right? So it could be, again, so that example doesn't necessarily mean that trade doesn't work, but it does at least question how strong of an influence it is. It's certainly not enough. So what may be true is that free trade decreases the likelihood of war, but does not remove it. That's entirely possible and would be consistent with the evidence, at least in the lead up to World War I. So still a lot of work that needs to be done. All right, the second is ideational liberalism. So moving on from commercial liberalism, this focuses on the configuration of domestic social identities and values as a basic determinant of state preferences and therefore of interstate conflict and cooperation. So remember, again, in the first one where we talked about there's differences in scarcity, in values and its ability to influence society, right, or power within society. So this is looking at the different values, right? So within any given state, but also across states, there's different values that exist, right? So there may be some people who are, you know, very supportive of war within a society for any number of reasons, based on values, based on economic interest, based on anything. There are some people who really believe that war is not a good, right, thing. And they'll be competing over control over foreign policy. And whoever is dominant within the foreign policy establishment, or who's able to have more of a voice in government, will shape state policies. I mean, certainly would be easy to understand how, you know, if you have a foreign policy based on war is a useful part of the foreign policy apparatus or foreign policy toolkit, versus those who think that war is not an appropriate element of foreign policy toolkit, how that would lead to very different foreign policies. And now it's just, it's about more than just views. That was a very simplifying one in terms of, although it's one that we certainly look at, is, you know, support for war. We refer to one of the major kind of, which we'll return to later, when we talk about public opinion, one of the major kind of foreign policy attitudes, or kind of elements of foreign policy attitudes, division between what we talk about hawks or doves. Hawks view war as a useful element of foreign policy, and doves typically view war as not being a useful element of the foreign policy toolkit. So one element that could come in is in terms of social identity. That could come, so the set of preferences shared by individuals concerning the proper scope and nature of public good provision, which in turn specifies the nature of legitimate domestic order by stipulating which social actors belong in the polity and what is owed to them. So each different state will have, and each different individual will have a conception of social identity. So who are we and what are we owed, right? Who belongs in our group? Who are Canadians and who are not Canadians, and what are owed to Canadians, right? So it could be in terms of strong social identity, in terms of, you know, some people who live in Canada are Canadians, and some people who not are don't really belong, and there's a difference in terms of what we're owed. So who gets to make a decision as to, you know, in terms of foreign policy? So kind of in terms of, could be leading to internal conflict between true Canadians and not Canadians, and how that could have spillover. So think about, for example, within the US, debate over illegal immigration, right? Who belongs here, right? And now that sounds like just domestic politics, right? But if you look at US foreign policy towards Mexico and towards many Latin American, Central American, Latin American states, that is shaped in large parts at times, under certain regimes, in terms of their perspective on illegal immigration. Those who have, you know, greatly oppose illegal immigration and want to get ended as much as possible because these people don't belong, right? Take their foreign policy towards Central American and Mexico, Central American states and Mexico, is greatly shaped by a desire for those states to limit the influx of illegal immigrants to the US, right? If those states take stronger policies, so if Mexico takes policies that block illegal immigrants from Central America into Mexico, then they would be blocking those ones from then coming up to the US border, right? So the US would be pushing Mexico to have a strong southern border. It may also be in terms of, you know, if Mexico and Central American states take, you know, put in place policies, you know, improve economically, improve human rights, stop civil conflicts, then if those states are able to do so, then you may have fewer people who are fleeing those countries hoping to come to the US. So you may have policies in terms of, okay, change your humanitarian rights, change your economic conditions, change social conflict. So all of these foreign policy pressures are being placed by the US. Foreign policy goals are shaped by this conception of who we are and what is owed to us. Social identity could also be a source of conflict. So what happens if two different social identities in two states include the same territory? So who we are, where we belong, and what's owed to us. What if two states say, you know, this territory belongs to us, right? This is French territory, this is German territory. So French look at this territory and say, this territory is part of our social identity. We're not complete unless this territory is here, or unless these people are here with us, are a part of our state. And Germany looks at the same territory and says, we're not complete unless this territory is with us, and these people belong within Germany, right? These are German people who live there, they belong here. But France looks at it and said, no, these are French people, and they belong within France. Well, and then you can see, and I use that example because there's been repeated disputes between France and Germany over controls over certain territories. So there are several wars fought over control of Alsace-Lorraine territory between France and Germany, and different conceptions over what belongs to us can certainly lead to conflict. So there's many different ways in terms of how social identity, but just ideas, different values, right? So I've talked about, could be values about, what are appropriate foreign policies, right? That can shape a state's foreign policy, and the competition over that can shape different foreign policies, but also conceptions of who we are, who belongs here, and what is owed to us can also, so social identity can shape very different foreign policies. So one of the most prominent theories or theories really in international relations in general, but certainly within liberalism, is a democratic peace theory. And there's multiple different arguments, but one of them, the normative argument, fits squarely within ideational liberalism. And the normative argument, and so democratic peace theory is essentially the argument that democratic states don't fight other democratic states. There's also some versions of democratic peace theory who said democracies just fight fewer wars. That one's found much weaker evidence. So it typically is democracies, the argument typically goes, democracies don't fight other democracies. And one of the arguments is the normative argument. So states have the right to be free from foreign intervention. So there's a belief that states have the right to be free from foreign intervention. Since morally autonomous citizens hold rights to liberty, the states that democratically represent them have the right to exercise political interdependence. Mutual respect for these rights then becomes the touchstone of international liberal theory, right? So if you're a democracy, right, and you hold to the belief, right, that, and most democracies hold to the belief that the people have the right to choose their government and control kind of their destiny, right? People are free, people have the right to choose their government. So say I'm Canadian, and I believe that, it's my right to participate in the democratic process, to be a participant in choosing how my country is going to be run. Well, it would be contradictory to that belief to look at people in another democratic state and say, okay, the US, right? These are free people too, who to say, these people don't have the right to participate in choosing their own destiny. So according to the normative perspective, then wars only fought for liberal ends. So you don't fight illiberal wars. So it would be illiberal for me to start a conflict against another democracy, because in doing so, I'd be interfering in the right of these morally autonomous citizens. I'd be interfering in their right to exercise their liberty, right? Just as I have the right to be free and choose how my state's going to be governed or to participate in the democratic process, so too do Americans, or so too do Brits have the right to participate in their democratic process and choose their government, because their government represents them. So it's not my right to interfere in that government. That's not an appropriate thing to do. And if I hold the right that people are free and should be free and should be autonomous and should be able to participate in the democratic process, right, that it's contradictory for me to deny those rights to other people. Now, wars can still be fought according to this logic against against non-democracies, right? Because those governments are not representing the will of the people. People have not been free to select the government. People are therefore not being able to operate as morally autonomous citizens. Their rights are being denied. And so therefore, any actions taken by that government, any policy selected by that government, don't hold legitimacy under kind of this, everybody should be against in the area of, states should be free from foreign intervention. The policies pursued by other democratic states are legitimate in terms of the belief in people holding the rights and liberty. And so should be free from foreign intervention. But when it comes to non-democratic states, that's not true because people haven't been free. The state isn't representing the people. Since democracies can trust other democracies will respect their rights, liberal wars can only be fought against the liberal state, right? You also end up with, not only do I not want to challenge necessarily the rights of, or kind of intervene in another state's, or interfere with another state's exercise of its sovereignty because it's not right. I also believe that other democracies will believe that about myself, about interfering in, so Canada isn't going to feel like it's appropriate to interfere, or Canadians won't feel like it's appropriate to interfere in US politics. And we also believe or trust that Americans will feel like it's not appropriate to interfere in Canadian politics. And so you can end up with kind of a zone of peace. We trust, you end up with a possibility also of greater cooperation because we trust that the other state isn't going to interfere. The third version of liberalism is Republican liberalism. It focuses on the ways in which domestic institutions and practices aggregate demands, transforming them into state policy, right? So far we've talked about in both Republican and ideational liberalism that within any given state, there's competing different groups, right? Some people, again, support free trade, some people oppose free trade. Some people within the state might view, some are hawks who think the use of military force is an appropriate element of the foreign policy toolkit, and those who view it as not a useful element of the useful or appropriate element of the foreign policy toolkit, right? But somehow one, and we've talked about, one will win and become, and the state will represent those interests. But we haven't talked about how one side wins. Is it just the side that has a greater numerical advantage? Maybe, sometimes. Is it the side that, it does depend on what certain key members, so like in society believe and what most of the rest believe or desire doesn't matter? Well, that's going to depend. That's what Republican liberalism tries to answer. And so they look at the domestic institutions, right? So it turns out that, who wins in these competitions depends a lot on how domestic institutions are structured. So for example, in a democracy where there's voting, we'll see that, now this isn't always the case, it depends somewhat on the nature of the democratic institutions and how well functioning and corrupt and everything like that. But in general, in democratic institutions, it's more likely to be true that the majority opinion will be exercised in foreign policy, right? Because the majority will be able to elect more representatives. They'll be putting pressure on those representatives. And those representatives will probably be like-minded, or they'll be able to put pressure on those representatives to be like-minded, and therefore foreign policy will be the result of the majority view. Could be some limitations to that. In authoritarian regimes, right, where there's no democratic election, what really is going to end up mattering is what the leader or the small group who surround the leader, so the elites within the society, what they believe. So say 5% of the population are part of the elite in a particular authoritarian regime and 95% are not. You could have the entire 95% who believe, who oppose free trade, but that 5% all support free trade. In that case, right, with that particular structure of domestic institutions, it's likely that the government's going to pursue free trade because all of those who matter in making decisions according to those domestic institutions, those who hold domestic power, believe in free trade. So you could end up with very varying, so you could have the exact same configurations, right? So you could have in two different states. You could have one 95%, in both of them, 95% oppose free trade, 5% support free trade. And in the two different states, you could have, in the democracy, in all likelihood, the 95% will win. In the authoritarian regime, if 5% are all concentrated, or most of the 5% are all concentrated in the elite circle, then it could be that you get the opposite policy. So who's going to win depends on domestic institutions. So key variable is mode of domestic representation. Policy depends on which domestic interests are represented, and that depends on the configuration of domestic institutions. Now, there's often, one of the arguments kind of within Republican liberalism has often been that public wars are less likely in democracies because public opposes wars. And so in democracies where they have greater say, wars are less likely. Now, just before we get into the democratic piece, kind of the Republican side of it, it's important to note that public doesn't always oppose wars. So first you have the rally around the flag effect. Once a war begins, even people who typically, members of the public who typically oppose war will usually rally and back the war and the government leaders. So they may have been against the war before it started, but once the war started, they want to win, right? So nationalism kind of kicks in, and they say, you know, this may not have been my preference, but I sure don't want to lose this war because that's bad for us. And it's bad for us economically, militarily, but also I'm just attached to, I don't want our soldiers to die. I'm attached to our country and I want my country to win. Nationalism kicks in. And so anticipating this effect, Republican liberalism have developed the diversionary theory of war, which argues that liberals who anticipate the rally around the flag effect can distract from domestic problems by provoking conflict with another group. So say you've got a government that's very unpopular. It could be an authoritarian one that's anticipating a coup coming, or it could be a democratic one that has got a lot of domestic problems and they're anticipating losing an election. Well, if they can't solve the domestic problems, what they could try doing is provoking a war, knowing that once a war begins, even if it's a war that people traditionally oppose, if public support for the government increases, it may make it less likely that the coup will occur or they lose the upcoming election, because you don't want to be undermining the government during a war. So it could be a way of, and then it gives you time to potentially solve those domestic problems, or at least deal with them in a future time, so to stay in power. So these are based on what we see in terms of the public rally around the flag effect. Based on that finding, you could develop the versionary theory of war, which looks at kind of the use of Republican liberal ideas. So how the kind of the structure of institutions influences foreign policy. Returning to democratic peace theory, so the Republican liberal argument for democratic peace theory would say that the public pays the cost of war in blood and treasure. And so in democracies, the public constrains leaders. So in democracies, when the public is looking at the possibility for a war, they know that at the end of the day, it's their taxes that are going to pay for the war, and they're going to be, the public knows they're going to be ones serving in the military and potentially dying in the war. It's not the elites typically, right? The elites will still make their money usually, and the elites aren't typically going to be fighting in the war. It's the public who bears these costs, right? And because they know that they're going to be paying these costs, the public will typically be oppose wars before they happen, and they will use their powers as within a democracy, you know, the threats to vote leaders out to constrain leaders, saying, if you go into this war, we will punish you and remove you from office. Firstly, even in authoritarian regimes, it's the public who pays the cost of war. But even if they oppose the war, they lack the ability to constrain leaders. Now, let's put this together. So democratic peace theory in general. So one of the most, and liberal, and typically liberal. There are some kind of approaches to or explanations of democratic peace theory that would fall outside of what we refer to as liberalism, but most of them, most of the time, we think of democratic peace theory in general as a liberal theory. We've seen that there's ideational and Republican liberal variants to it, but in general, we would put it as a liberal theory. So it's one of the most prominent theories in international politics, even though realism, we'd say, is probably the most dominant theory in IR, or kind of like family of theories or paradigm. We use sometimes to refer to families of theories. Probably the single most prominent theory itself would be democratic peace theory, which is a liberal theory. And so it's that, and based on the notion that democracies do not fight other democracies. Now there's issues with some of the individual explanations. So the structural one, that democracies are the public pays the cost of war, and so they oppose, they'll constrain the leaders. Now the problem with this argument is that democracies still fight wars, right? Democracies still fight wars against illiberal regimes. And from the structural argument, there's costs whether you fight other democracies or non-democracies. You're still going to be, people are still going to be dying, and there's still costs of the war, right? So it shouldn't matter from that perspective who you're fighting. But we see a tendency that democracies don't fight other democracies, right? So this public pays the cost of war and constrain leaders argument doesn't fully account for this. Now, you could make the argument possibly because it's on both sides, and the public on both sides constrain the leaders, and that's why you don't get wars, because it's, but that would only make sense if it was only authoritarian regimes who initiated wars against democracies. But that's not the case. Democracies still do initiate wars against non-democracies, right? So the structural argument by itself isn't sufficient to explain the results. Normative argument faces some questions too. Do liberal states recognize other liberal states? It's based on the assumption that democracies know who the other democracies are. And so therefore we'll view it as illegitimate to fight other democracies. But debate as to what another democracy is, and the definition of democracy is very complex, and assigning kind of how democratic a state is something that typical, forget about even public, even many leaders would struggle with. How democratic is one country vis-a-vis another? And so you end up with possibilities of misperception, right? But we don't see, because we don't see democracies fighting other democracies, we don't typically see these misperceptions. And that's not something the normative argument could account for. So at the end, some have argued that the democratic piece is a combination of normative and structural arguments, right? So it requires both to be put together. And if we put both together, we could explain that how democracies still fight wars and still initiate wars against non-democracies, but don't fight other democracies. And then finally, just want to end with the chapter on liberalism included a section on peace studies. So just want to have a brief discussion of peace studies. So we've been talking a lot about, you know, in IR, we're going to talk a lot about war, right? What are the causes of war? Now, some peace studies people say we shouldn't just be talking about the cause of war, we should also be talking about the cause of peace, because really what we want is peace, right? That's the ultimate goal. So rather than talk about how do we avoid war, what we should be talking about is how do we cause peace? Because that's actually our ultimate goal. Which begs the question, what is peace? So most definitions of peace focus on its negative definition. And by negative, I mean referring to an absence of something, right? So the absence of war, right? Typically when we talk about peace, we talk about, well, peace is the absence of war. Now, that's actually a poor definition. It's a poor definition because you should never be defining something by what it is not, right? Like we should be defining it based on what it is, right? So what is peace? What does peace actually mean, other than just we're not fighting? There's also other problems beyond just, that's not a great definition if we're just saying it's the absence of something, right? Absence of war doesn't imply source of conflict between countries have been resolved, and that there's no structural violence within countries. So first, right, so absence of war doesn't mean that there's not a whole bunch of underlying tensions that are waiting to simmer and come back, right? So you could still have highly conflictual relations between different countries, even if they're not at war with each other, right? So you could say they're not fighting right now, but is it really peace if it's just like a temporary halt while they catch their breath? Or it's just waiting for the peace agreement to fall apart again, but they still really hate each other? Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's great they're not fighting and killing each other at the moment, but if it's waiting to break out, that's not that wonderful, right? Really, our goal should be not just to stop the war, but to also get rid of the source of conflict, right? So that it's not just waiting for the next incident, the next crisis before you get another war, but we've solved the problem, right? And so peace studies are partially looking at how do we also solve the problem so that we're not just, how do we get rid of the source of conflict? And then structural violence. So what is structural violence? Violence produced through the structure of social relations, including hunger, poverty, and oppression. So within many different societies, kind of structure, international society or international system, but also domestic societies, right? There's structure that it produces, certain people are constantly living in hunger, poverty, or oppressive conditions. And it's hard to refer to something as, so, okay, two countries aren't fighting each other, but in both countries, there's a sizable minority of the population who are living in oppressive conditions, so they're being marginalized by the government or not be given rights by their government. They're living as second-class citizens. They're continually living in poverty and they're living in hunger. Great. Again, they're not fighting each other. Nobody's dying from war. But that's not to say that there's not violence. War isn't the only form of violence that exists in politics. And so some in peace studies also say, it shouldn't just be our goal to stop war, but it should be our goal to stop all forms of violence that exist in international politics. And that involves removing structural violence that exists within the international system, where some states, succeed and other states live in continual poverty. So, looking at, say, the global north, which we'll return to later, but say, the Western democracies have tremendous level of wealth, but then there's many societies within parts of Asia, Africa, parts of Latin America, who continually live in poverty. And part of our ability to exist in wealth and to have plenty is based on a system of structural social relations where we exchange our wealth on the backs of other people, and we hold them in, that structure holds them in perpetual poverty, oppression, and hunger. So can we really talk about peace if some states achieving kind of their comfortable position is based on oppressing other countries, or it's achieved through a structure that holds others down? And can we really talk about peace if even within societies, even within those more affluent societies, so Canada, the US, certain people, there's certain structures that exist within those societies where certain people are always, can't escape from poverty, can't escape from hunger, and can't escape from oppression. So are we really talking about peace under those conditions as well? So peace studies have developed, many who've worked within peace studies have tried to move beyond the negative definition of peace, of where we're talking about absence of war, to a more positive definition of peace, in terms of peace that resolves the underlying reasons for war, not just a ceasefire, but a transformation of relationships, including elimination or reduction of economic exploitation and political oppression. So it's a much tougher it's easier to just stop war. It's much tougher to achieve this positive definition of peace, but really isn't that what we're looking for? Are we happy enough with just peace as, okay, we got rid of all war, but there's still rampant oppression? I mean, that's really great if you live in that negative definition of just stopping war is really great if you live in, if in the structure of society, of international politics, domestic politics, you live in one of the privileged positions, right? Because absence of war means, your position will be even better. No one's challenging the position. No one's trying to overthrow it. You've got great trade going on. Your position is nice and secure. It's not so great, the absence of war. I mean, it's good in some ways, but it's not so great for those who are on the bottom, right? It removes the possibility for changing your position. And even though, yes, there's no war, which is in many ways great, you're still being exploited. You're still living in hunger. You're still living in poverty. You're still living in violence, domestic violence. So, there's questions, how great is that? So those are things to think about as we move throughout the semester. So continually when we're talking about, particularly when we're talking about theories of conflict, right? A lot of them are going to be focused on avoiding war or ending war, right? Fewer of them are going to be talking about these other factors. So that's something to bear in mind. All right, so that's the end of our liberalism lecture. I hope that you all enjoyed it, and I'll see you for next class where we'll talk about neoliberal institutionalism.